Hi, my name is Naki Osute. I'm Associate Vice President for Social Impact Canada at TD Bank Group. On behalf of TD, I'd like to thank you for being here today. This February is not just another African Heritage Month. We are gathering at a time where Black communities and their allies around the globe are demanding we confront the ongoing realities of anti-Black racism in every aspect of society. We must continue to push progress forward. When we launched the TD Ready commitment in 2018, our goal was to support the conditions necessary for a more equitable tomorrow. Now, 3 years later, that commitment has put us on a path to help address inequities across social, economic, and environmental spheres. We continue to seek out better ways to support the Black customers, colleagues, and communities we serve today and into the future. Over the last year, we've invested more time than ever before in dialogue with community and industry leaders from Black-led, Black-owned, and Black-serving organizations, while centering the voices of Black TD colleagues. And we're embedding these lessons learned into our institution, driving change and creating a better bank as we move forward. So on behalf of TD, I thank you for supporting our collective learning journey with your presence here today.
This is Our Stories, Our Experiences, a talk show series with me, Rajean Willis. This 4-episode series will center the voices of African Nova Scotian people, their stories, and their experiences. We will uncover topics such as racial trauma, grief and loss, collective healing and wellness, and community development. It is our hope that this series will empower, educate, and enlighten our viewers. Today, to start off our series, we'll talk about racial trauma, the intersection of race and trauma, racism and trauma, specifically for us, anti-Black racism. I have special guests with me today, Lana McLean, Angela Bowden, and Derico Simons, all who have something important to say on this topic. As a brief introductory, Lana McLean is originally from Whitney Pier, Nova Scotia. She's a registered practicing clinical social worker with over 30 years of experience working in the fields of addiction, mental health, and emergency medicine, and also private practice. She is a lead consultant regarding cultural responsiveness and capacity within various sectors. Angela Bowden is an African Nova Scotian author, TEDx speaker, writer, poet, and activist. Through her many published and unpublished work and her recent book, Unspoken Truth, Unmuted and Unfiltered, she highlights, documents, and challenges systemic and overt racism. Angela balances activism with writing and self-care and encourages self-love, empowerment, and healing. And Derico Simons is a fearless advocate for racialized and marginalized communities in Halifax, wearing many different hats, including founder of 3 nonprofit organizations in Halifax, ACE Halifax, Game Changers 902, and CLT 902 Community Land Trust. Welcome all to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Good to be here.
So I just wanted to start by asking, when you think of racial trauma or racism and trauma and how these intersect, what are some of the ways that African Nova Scotian people specifically have suffered from this type of injury, and how has it impacted our lives? Lana, would you want to start?
Sure. I think it's impacted our lives in multiple domains. Sometimes we just suffer through, and to take on that collective awareness would be actually traumatizing if we actually had to decompress or deconstruct all those intersectionalities, Regine. I think the most prevalent thing we've recently come across in Nova Scotia is carding or street checks. The prevalence of Black men being, because they're Black and male, issues of race, being pulled over racially by police, our CMP, is just the most probably recent issue that I can speak to. And then it triggers the history of anti-Black violence or anti-Black racism against Black men and Black women and our youth and their relationships with policing. So that's just the most contemporary version of how race and trauma intersect. So then, as a person of African descent, we don't feel safe with police, and their job is to serve and protect. So the question is then, how do we then have meaningful relationships with policing organizations when we don't feel protected or served? So that's just the most prevalent, the most recent thing that comes to my mind. And then the other piece is just looking at the impacts of COVID. And the trauma and the racism and the issues with respect to how things get spoken to, how communities are identified as compliant or non-compliant, the coded language that we use in various different parts of that we receive in various different parts of our lives, in various different domains, healthcare, education. So race and trauma intersect. Race and trauma have historical origins in our lives. You know, you don't have police checks or unless you had the surveillance of Black bodies through policing during enslavement, right? Through the bounty hunters. Those are the things that the epigenetics or the traumas in our lives that get elevated and escalated. And when we assert ourselves, our assertion is seen and deemed to be defiant or oppositional or need to be policed again. So there's this pattern around policing of Black bodies that impacts how we actually feel safe or don't, that can trigger trauma events and trauma histories, both intergenerationally and in a contemporary world.
It's layered, it's complex, but it's painful.
It's painful. And I think the other part, as we spoke to just before going into recording, is that sometimes we don't have the capacity or the tolerance or the emotional availability to actually heal from that because it's onslaughting us all the time, that we have to pick and choose where we're going to land and how we're going to address those particular issues. Hence why it's so important for the African Nova Scotian community to have allies. Hence why it's so important for our African Nova Scotian community to have functioning community-based organizations, similar to the ones that Derico has set up, and other ones in our community like DPAD, to speak to those issues on behalf of the community, because sometimes we just don't have the individual emotional availability to do it and to heal. I think, you know, we don't always have the access to the clinical supports that we need.
Absolutely.
I only know of maybe 1 or 2 Black psychologists, 1 or 2 Black psychiatrists, and a handful of Black clinicians. That's not a lot of folks, and the availability, and then the fee for services. So there's layers within our community around accessing to healing supports, when the province, or actually the Nova Scotia Health, should be actually having cultural capacity and cultural competency as core mandates for their staff, for us to have access to healthcare in a meaningful way. So that's how race and trauma intersect again.
And so you mentioned one thing too about like the constant onslaught. And so, you know, I like to think in pictures and analogies. And so, you know, thinking about standing outside in the pouring rain and trying to dry off, it's not going to happen. And so we're constantly living our lives sort of trying to dry off in a sense while it's continually coming at us. And, you know, I think that the intersection of race and trauma, sort of contemporary today, is a historical and generational manifestation of society in itself not actually being, it was never meant to for Black folks when white folks were constructing and sort of stealing and taking Black folks from their home country. And so now we're seeing sort of the manifestation today. And really when I think about racial trauma, I think that, you know, any sort of type of ism, why it's so sort of deep is that not only could that event be traumatic if someone says, I'm not going to hire you because you're Black, that event itself is traumatic, but then the racial part has you questioning your identity. Well, geez, you know, what is it about my skin? What is it about me? What is it about my culture? And I feel like there's a double layer there that sort of hits you when you're experiencing this particular layer of trauma. But, you know, I think that it impacts Black people in every single domain of their life. There's not one that I can't think of, unless you're just with a group of Black folks. Yeah. But employment, justice, healthcare, every single life domain. I think that racial trauma impacts the whole life of a Black person.
And quality of life.
Absolutely.
And longevity.
Yeah.
It's really something that we need to be acknowledging as Black folk and understanding, being able to really recognize what's happening within us, and not in an internalization way, I think, which often happens, and people don't really understand what's going on, but to bring awareness to the fact that the things that you may be going through are intergenerational, and you may not have any control at all of what happens to you and even how you deal with it, Angie?
Yeah, and I was just going to add to what Derico was saying there, like when he speaks about there's not a place where it's not happening, there's not a place where you can't see this manifesting in your life. And I look around just Nova Scotia and some of the incidences that have been happening over the last 3-4 years, and the way in which we look at those. And one in particular I'm going to speak about is the incident that happened in Yarmouth at the Nova Scotia Community College. And there was depicted a picture of a young Black girl as a mother, and she was carrying a baby on her hip with a Starbucks coffee in one hand, extensions. She had booty shorts on. She had the stereotypical tramp stamp tattoo across her back, high heel shoes. She's carrying a baby. And the message was how not to ECE. And that message is very clear when we're looking at Black women in terms of what we see and how we perceive Black women and how we look at them. And we could look at that and say, that's an innocent picture that somebody put up, we'll tear it down and it's gone. But what we don't recognize is those are hardened ideals, and those hardened ideals and stereotypes become people who have positions of power. I'll give you an example. I lost my son in 1996 as a result of some of those stereotypes, showing up at the hospital at odd hours of the night, poorly dressed, as they would probably see it, because you're rushing to throw things on. And so I was never really given the attention, or he was never really given the attention that he required, because the focus was on the mother, right? And how she presented herself. And so there's a little bit of that identity politics where we have to show up, and we have to show up with looking the part, right? Or we won't be taken seriously. And so we look at these over dramatizations of stereotypes like that took place at the Nova Scotia Community College. And we look at how that actually starts to filter into people's psyche, right? And so it doesn't just become an innocent stereotype. It becomes this hardened ideal that people take to work with them, and then they affect other people's lives with those types of ideals, and leads to all of this racial trauma that we see.
Absolutely. Thank you for using that example, because, if you've not seen or had any access to an article on that, it's a good example to go back and look to and just see clearly, this is what we're talking about here. It's not innocent stuff. There's so much history behind it, white supremacy, Black inferiority. And I think we need to have more talks around that. So kind of building upon this, when you think about the experiences of racial trauma so unique to Nova Scotia and African Nova Scotian people, we talked about the street checks. Why, when we think about the historical elements to that, and people have really said that Nova Scotia is, maybe the most racist place in the world,
of the North.
Yeah. So, or at least in Canada, and we have such a rich history in this province. In your opinion, how are the experiences of racial trauma so unique to our African Nova Scotian communities and people?
Well, I just wanted to highlight that Maclean's magazine in 2020 noted the most racist city in Canada was Winnipeg.
Okay.
So, and I think that speaks to the amplification of the Indigenous voice and the amount of impact there. Now let's go east. Yeah, we're the Mississippi of the North. So we got to get some balance on the East Coast and the West Coast.
Right.
But I think, Rajean, to answer your question, at least from a clinical perspective, What is unique to the African Nova Scotian community is our longevity here. We are not first generation, we're not second generation, we're not third. Some of us are sixth, seventh, eighth generation African Nova Scotians, people whose families came here through the early 1600s. Right. We are a part of the fabric of this place. We actually built this place. Our foremothers and forefathers built Citadel Hill. Our foremothers and forefathers fought in wars. We have contributed to the fabric of this society and its success, and yet we have reaped none of the benefits. So the juxtaposition of being able to say, what's so uniquely different about being African Nova Scotian? Well, Cindy Kane's t-shirts say it, we've been here. Yeah. And I think people fail to see that unique location of us in our historical rootedness in this province gives us the voice that needs to be heard, the experience that needs to be witnessed, and most importantly, a cultural responsiveness to all those particular business units within government, all these different organizations that we actually contribute through our tax dollar, that we don't reap the benefit. And when we actually say there's an issue from Africville to Sunnyvale, to Whitney Pier, to Shelburne, all across this province, Black communities have been hard hit, not just because some of them are rural, but because of the longevity of anti-Black racism in those communities and its negative impact on Black brain, around the Black body and on the Black mind. That those trauma experiences just aren't one generation, they're intergenerational. So the experience of people of other African descendants coming into this country as first generation or second, they come in from a location slightly different than where we came. Right. A lot of our ancestors came from the robbing of us from places like Africa. So when people come to Canada who are out from the motherland, their experiences and their richness in their own culture is transposed here. And so their cultural literacy and their racial literacy may not be as nuanced as ours. We've lived and had to survive. So I think people of African Nova Scotian descent have a different level of race-based literacy, and we know racism when we see it, and we don't have to interrogate it as much as some of our new Canadian brothers and sisters.
Very good point. Rico, you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was going to talk as well about, I think that a lot of its uniqueness, as Lana had mentioned, is rooted in sort of our generational history here. And so I'm eighth generation African Nova Scotian, and I can ask every single person in my family. They've all experienced similar, the same, different, or sometimes worse than what I have experienced. And, I think that, being one of the founding people of this province, building streets, buildings, and contributing lives, blood, sweat, and tears, and lives to the social fabric of Nova Scotia, but getting and having little to no recognition, or recognition, I would say appreciation, even for what African Nova Scotians have done for not only Nova Scotia, but a lot of Black folks in Canada have roots coming from here. And so to be a contributing people to the country, to the province, but then being one of the most discriminated against, being a population that is one of the most underemployed, suffering one of the most at the hands of the justice system, puts you in a really unique position, and not so much in a good way, but peeling the layers back, being one of the founding groups of this province alongside our Indigenous peoples, but then just not having any recognition or appreciation, or even to raise these issues, to be looked at as if, what are you talking about? It doesn't happen here.
Right. And it's so true too. And I think where that kind of comes up in my mind is when we're dealing with activism and people coming on board to sort of support a lot of these challenges that's going on. And you see them afraid to speak out. Like, we have the founding members in this province afraid to even participate in this province in all various types of ways, right? And so they kind of just sit back, recognize, well, I shouldn't say recognize, because it's I know in my family, there's a lot of unrecognition in race trauma and what's going on, right? And so, like, it's trying to wrap your head around it, because nobody in your family has wrapped their head around it. And when you speak about it, it's like you're speaking a different language, because no one's understanding what you're saying, because it's so intergenerational that I look at my mother's generation, they just accepted it, status quo, right? And that was just the way that it was. And that really was just the way that it was. And so when you see the things emerging like George Floyd happening, and it sort of gets everybody mobilized in this Black Lives Matter movement, and everybody's sort of understanding, because COVID slowed everything down and we kind of are paying attention. What I saw quite clearly in my community was a lot of people still weren't at the point yet where they could even identify for themselves what race trauma was, what it looked like, how it was impacting their lives, that it was okay to speak about it, that it was okay to say, like, this is happening to me, because sometimes the complaint process is just as injurious as the initial injury that race has caused in the first place. And so I suffer from post-traumatic stress syndrome, and I also suffer from generalized anxiety disorder with panic attacks as a direct result of racialized trauma in the workplace. And so even talking about these topics now, I get jittery, right? Like that's one of the consequences that I face, even being in this room in a safe environment, talking about these things. It brings back. And so when these things happen in our community, that's another impact. It rips open old wounds for a lot of people, generation upon generation. And so I think the first step for me, I know in my family, was healing. Like, I had to take those steps to heal those traumas. But people around me weren't really understanding what race trauma even was. Like, we talk about other people understanding. We don't have a good grasp on it because it's just the way that it's been. I know in my family, I've often been looked at as the troublemaker, not anymore, but I've often been looked at as the troublemaker, like she has too much to say. And in reality, I'm trying to actually protect all of us, right? And I think that's what we all do, is when we use our voices, but they're not always accepted because people are like, what's the big deal? What's going on? We don't really have an understanding, a good grasp on what's going on ourselves. And until we really accept for ourselves that, yeah, I'm not going crazy. This is happening to me. This is happening to other people. And providing these safe spaces and conversations like this to talk about it, I think is really helpful.
Well, I think that something you mentioned just, it made me think about often in our communities, we don't always have the language to put to what I'm feeling or what that experience was.
And we weren't allowed to feel or have.
Absolutely. And even then, if we sort of double down and throw in that race is a social construction and it's constructed by white anthropologists, that then throws another sort of wrench in there to think about. And so in our communities, when we're constantly being onslaughted with these traumas that we're experiencing, even from a young age, not having the words to put to the trauma that we're experiencing. And then again, Atlanta mentioned not having the mass of sort of clinical experts and expertise. We certainly have some great folks, but we need more. And so not having the actual clinical therapeutic infrastructure to deal with 400 years or 8th or 10th generations of racial trauma, what is that going to do to a people? And then not having the language to discuss it, just sort of getting through or just going by.
Y'all have segued into some of the conversation that we want to get into after the break. So we'll take a quick break right now, and then we'll talk more about what role Black folks have in identifying, articulating, and understanding trauma in their own lives when it comes to racism. So we'll be right back.
Hi everyone, my name is Renee, and I'm the founder of Elevate and Explore Black Nova Scotia. aimed at encouraging more Black travelers to visit Nova Scotia and to inspire people from all backgrounds to explore our beautiful province. We can't wait to have you.
Okay, welcome back to Our Stories, Our Experiences, a talk show series with me, Rajean Willis, and my guests today, Lana McLean, Angela Bowden, and Derico Simons. We're talking about race and trauma and how they intersect. So before the break, we were talking about the role that Black folks, African Nova Scotians, specific to our context here, what role they have in understanding, articulating, and taking ownership in some ways of their own experiences with racism and trauma in a way that promotes healing. So Lana.
Well, I just want to piggyback for a moment and circle back to what Derico and Angela had said earlier. And I want to give our community a little bit of grace, because this is all new language.
Yes.
And one of our responsibilities is to help give language to those experiences. In a world in which Black folks not only are being inundated by trauma on a daily basis, either microracial aggressions, systemic trauma, but also that we're still in a world where our lives, we have multiple competing priorities. So what do we prioritize today? Do I want to prioritize my pain, or do I need to prioritize the paycheck so I can have my kids eat and blah, blah, blah? So the access to healing is a privilege that white folks have that Black folks don't always have access to, because of those competing priorities, because of, as Derico alluded to, or noted, the lack of access to culturally relevant and culturally competent healthcare providers, and the small pockets of where we are located. Most Black clinicians are located in Halifax. Yeah. So again, that's marginalizing even those in our rural communities. But as a parent, I think that's where I find hope. That, Dr. Stacey Patton wrote a book called Stop Whooping Black Children, The Legacy of Racism and Trauma in the Lives of Black Families. And one of the things that we have done consciously or subconsciously is that we have, to break the intergenerational chains, as Dr. DeGroy would say, is that we have to capture those moments that we find ourselves doing crazy white ass things, because we think it's the right thing to do to prepare or get our kids ready for the racism that they will encounter. And one of the simplest things we can do is not hurt or harm our children.
Yes, amen.
Don't put your hands on your kids. Don't throw a shoe at your child. Don't be put, learn to communicate and give your child the emotional literacy about why they're feeling the way they're feeling. Helping to redirect their anger, or whether it's righteous or unjustified. But ways that we can actually give our children opportunities as parents, those little grains of seeds to actually plant some seeds of hope, so we can, pivot the narrative, not forgetting the history, but developing a new healthy patterns in our families and in our communities. Instead of going after each other, let's love on each other, right?
Yes.
Instead of the issues of lateral violence in our community that take out so many of our young Black men. Those are those particular things around how we have been cognitively not prepared for how we need to do the change we need to do. We're always cognitively prepared for the onslaught of racism, but not how to make those meaningful changes in the smallest ways. So I think what is our accountability? It is one to get the knowledge and have people who we trust with that, give us the literacy to understand it, to build on cultural competency in our parenting practices. Every parent has some frustration tolerance going on. Since we've moved out of intact communities into different hovels and different places, we've lost that collaborative parenting practice. Sometimes it's claiming some of those rituals and those places to help us be better parents, to be our better and more glorious selves, to be the kings and queens. We know historically that our children are to be honored, our elders are to be honored, and we have losing some of those cultural capacities and cultural values that have allowed us to sustain ourselves. We're in a precarious time where who we are as a people in Nova Scotia and what we consider community is becoming fragmented.
Yes.
And I'm mindful that what we can do is plant some seeds in our own backyards and to actually bring our kids out to events, connect them to the elders, connect them to young people, connect them so they know that their responsibility is not based on their individuality, but on the racial values and cultural values of community, that our oneness is makes us strong, not to perpetuate harm to each other.
And I love that. And I think that, you know, that is a responsibility that we have as parents or just older people in the community to teach the kids, to love them up, to praise them in private, but public also. And I think that, you know, if they're not getting it at home, we can't expect them to get it other places like school or in their sports and extracurricular activities, you know? So we have to take on that responsibility. And that kind of goes into where I want to go next with the conversation in terms of what role do non-Black people have in this understanding, educating themselves, learning more about race and trauma and the intersect and the impact of this. Dorico?
I think that, you know, I guess, so first thing that I would say is that sort of the notion of allyship, or it's not a finite destination that you sort of arrive to. And so often I think people think that, companies, governments think that there's a certain training, but it's a, you know, if I have to experience this my whole life and you're a supporter and ally to me, then it's a lifelong journey for you too. And so we have to almost be in this together. And so, you know, I think that in terms of the responsibility or accountability, is that it's almost a luxury for a Black person to be able to work through, dissect, and then also present and educate on the topic. And so folks who are in sort of allyship positions, I think that they play a big role because white folks are the major perpetrators of racism. And so I don't want to generalize and say all white people, but I will say that the major perpetrators of racism are white folks. And so to be in sort of a position, we know that in a lot of, we know that there's sort of a disproportionate number of white men CEOs. We know that there's lack of representation at certain positions. And so when you're in these roles, when you're in these governments, I think that white folks have a strong and need to have a strong position to take when it comes to racial trauma, racial equity, support, advocacy, and then also just walking with. Because again, if I've got to experience it for my whole life, I need you to also then be a supporter with me for that duration. We don't just arrive.
Right. I love that.
I agree. It's like a symbiotic relationship. I see it as too, Dorico, because I look at any time when I wanted to learn anything, I rolled up my sleeves, I filled out an application, and I went to school, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the responsibility to learn has to fall on the person who needs to learn, right? And like, can we just create space for Black children to be Black children? Like, I would just, if I could tell white parents anything, it would be teach your children to share the space. Because I'm telling our children to go out and take up their space and to be who they are and to embrace and embody all of what they are and trying to break some of that intergenerational stuff that we had to know our place and you're too loud and did you wash your face and all of those sort of things that kind of just kept us in these boxes. And so I go back to, I always think about this interview Dr. Carrie Best had, I believe back in the 90s. And in that interview, she said that when we as parents teach our children that they are just as good, if not better than anybody else, then we can start to move this ball a little bit. So I think sometimes at home when we don't realize it, like you said with the shoe and the comb, the fly swatter, the whatever, like Black moms are unemotionally available sometimes, right? Like, and that's understandable. So are Black fathers. There's a lot out there that's beating us up on a day-to-day basis. So when we come home, we're unemotionally available to our families to actually give them what we would like to, or what other races are able to, or white people are able to. So I know coming home, I had this 20-minute rule because I recognized that I go out and I give the best of me to everybody. And then I come home and my children instantly get the worst of me, right? Because everything I'm carrying comes in that door with me. And it doesn't come through the door with white people because they're not carrying the same things. And so I think our responsibility, the ones that know and the ones that are putting in the work, is to help model that behavior in our communities, help model that behavior in our families. And also, the language that Lana and Dorico spoke about, help provide some of that, because you know when you're feeling something. Like my whole life, I knew I was detached from something, but I didn't know what that was, right? I had no clue what that was until I knew what it was, until I became an adult, until I had the nervous breakdown, until I sought good therapy and was able to peel back those layers, right? And I can remember one time in therapy session, my therapist saying, Angela, you know how much therapy it took for you to get to this point of confidence, right? And knowing who you were. And can you imagine how much therapy your mother needs? Can you imagine how much therapy your grandmother needed? Right? And so I think, I was through that process of therapy, I was able to grant my mother grace. I was able to grant my community elders grace. I was able to actually sit and listen to the pain. And sometimes it's painful to hear the internalization of self-hatred that our communities carry. And sometimes it's really difficult to, when you know the answer, and to not always give the answer, right? But I think it's important that we recognize that it is a relationship for life, it's not a one and done. Every day we go out there and we're carrying these loads. Our children are carrying it, our husbands, our wives, for everybody around us. So the Black communities are always in need of some gentleness and some grace. And I think that the white community can take responsibility by just lifting that load and educating themselves where they need to be educated, and setting those pathways for their children so that it doesn't just keep reproducing harm.
For sure.
Can I just touching base about what allied relationships are? Not only are they something that is, they have to be mindful. They're mindful relationships. And I think sometimes people, when they want to be allies, it sometimes can be situational. And as Dorico said, these are lifelong journeys and lifelong relationships. And I think being an ally also means having some humility.
Yes.
And that's a difficult place for people to go. And I think for folks who've been allies, when you say, check your privilege, they go, well, I've been working on this for all my life. And, and I think I always say, yes, you have I've been working on this all my life too, right? But I think with the pivot towards how do we create meaningful allied relationships, it's not just showing up at rallies. It's about showing up in the everydayness of things.
Right.
It's recognizing that you already have a legacy built on my back. So when, I get a little ahead, or somebody in our community gets a little ahead, know that took a lot of time and energy and a lot of sacrifice that some of folks, particularly white folks, did not have that same level of sacrifice. It might have been differently, but it's different levels of skin in the game. And I think allied relationships require, like I said, some cultural humility, but also some ongoing education. Racism is sophisticated at some of its core. It's so nuanced in ways that, sometimes I got to check myself. It was like, did I hear that right? Right? So you're checking my own sanity. And I think my ally cannot be a bystander in those things, saying, yes, Lana, you heard that right. And this is what I did about it.
That's right.
I think being an ally is one thing, but being a bystander becomes like when you are complicit in certain things. And I would ask anyone who wants to be an ally to do some of their own truth and reconciliation, or to actually interrogate their own lives about the places and times, so they can be authentic when they actually